All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this training session on how to build a threat detection strategy in AWS. This is your host, EH. I'm with Joseph Holbrook. Joseph is a cybersecurity expert. He's an author. He's an instructor. He has, uh, authored multiple courses on this topic as well as other cybersecurity topics and DevOps related topics as well. And I'll just hand it over to you now, Joseph.
All right, well, thank you. Appreciate the great introduction. Welcome aboard, everyone. I'm really excited that you're here to talk about how to build a threat detection strategy in AWS. Now, one of the exciting things about AWS is that they're constantly evolving. But before we get started, a quick little intro. My name is Joseph Holbrook, and I've been a speaker, an architect, an engineer, and focused in IT for over 25 years. I've been a specialist in cloud computing for CompTIA, as well as AWS. I'm also an AWS services partner as well. And I'm really looking forward to talking about IT security and AWS with you. So as far as the course, let's go ahead and find out what we're going to learn today. First, we're going to kick it off and talk about why the shared security model is really important to understand and how that can affect the threat detection strategies that we use as an organization. Now, generally, organizations that have been focused on the cloud for quite a while are really good at this and know how to effectively manage threats and isolate threats and also deal with what is called an APT, an advanced persistent threat. But with that said, no matter what your experience, you'll certainly will get a few things out of this. And especially with AWS, there's so many new services and new features. So I'll be talking about some of the more exciting security-related services. So we'll talk about intrusion detection systems, advanced threat detection systems, and other tools that enable a proactive response to threats. We'll talk about how we as an organization can build a threat reduction strategy. Then we'll talk about what the CAF is and why that's really important to understand. Now, Amazon has many years, of course, managing services in the cloud, and they're pretty much the leader in that area, but also one of the pioneers in that area as well. So they have some unique, what I would call collateral to bring to the table, and I'll talk more about that. I'm going to focus on a demo of AWS GuardDuty Monitoring. This is one of the more exciting services in AWS that can proactively monitor and detect issues going on in your environment. I'll then talk about the AWS Security Specialty Certification, and we'll go ahead and wrap up the course as well. Before we get started, did you know that ThreatStack found that 73% of companies had at least one critical security misconfiguration, such as leaving SSH open to the entire internet? Now, mistakes like SSH being open to the internet should be prevented and actually shouldn't even happen. However, when you scan your environment, you'll find commonly issues such as that, ports that are open, that are not blacklisted or whitelisted appropriately. Did you also know, for example, that the most incidents occur between credential theft and more sophisticated zero-day attacks against the cloud providers themselves? And this is according to the 2018 Verizon Data Center Breach Investigation Report. Did you know as well that the AWS S3 bucket name is not secret? Now, this is basically a global namespace. This is sort of like where you could go to the internet and type in a name, and it'll bring you right to that web page. And so if you know the S3 bucket address and can type it in, then you could get there. That's assuming that it's left publicly open. So we don't want to leave our buckets open because that still will expose us to the attackers. With that said, lastly, we could use the VPC flow log entries to scan and detect specific issues around attack patterns. When it comes to the shared security model, it is important to realize that both the customer and the provider have an interest in ensuring that security is maintained and that both parties are doing what the SLA states. So what is threat detection? Now, threat detection is where we're going through the process of being able to find threats on your network, your systems, or your applications. We're basically being proactive to find what these threats are. And this is similar in some respects to what we can do with pen testing to proactively determine, is that port open? Or is that S3 bucket open? Or is there an issue with that CSS script that was uploaded to the S3 share, for example? When it comes to threat detection, generally our threat detection tools should be able to pick up issues around malware, viruses, phishing, Trojans, ransomware, permissioning issues, backdoors as well. These are all common issues. Now, APT is the advanced persistent threat. This is where your enemy, for example, the attacker, the data thief, even the insider, is in your network and you're not actually aware that they might be packaging up, for example, AWS Lambda messages with data that really should not be leaving the company. So these are things that can happen. They're behind the scenes, they're not obvious. However, sometimes a little bit of work can actually find a lot of open doors for that matter. When it comes to techniques, tactics, and procedures, these are called the TTPs. Basically, we want to really think about the technique we use for determining threat detection. In other words, are we using, for example, a cloud-based provider solution? Are we proactively setting up basically these searches, these basically analysis? Are we running these tools? And procedures, what are our procedures to deal with the threat, for example? It's one of the challenges where there's so much information out there. The question is where do we start? How do we collect it? And how do we deal with information that really we shouldn't be finding? In other words, if we find, for example, that an attacker has been sending out FTPs for the last year, then that's a huge data breach, and we need to have a procedure to deal with that. Now, generally attackers, they're going to look for the following information. If they can get someone's credentials and this someone that has been compromised, or the credentials that they compromised, I should say, is root level or administrative level, then this could open up the door to the attacker and actually provide a huge windfall of information. And so we need to be really careful when we provision accounts to our users, because in effect, the account permissions may just be fine with the user, but if we're not following best practices of the principal of least privilege, then we are risking the fact that an attacker may actually grab the same credentials and actually start taking our information, copying it, replicating it, whatever they're trying to do. Financial information. And this is everything from basically bank account information, wire transfer information, etc. Health info and PII. Anything that identifies health records or patient doctor privilege or PII, like Social Security numbers in the US, or any kind of ID that can basically provide an identity, that is considered PII data. Corporate secrets. In other words, the attacker is really looking, of course, as well, not just for financial or health information or personal information, but corporate secrets could be a good incentive for them as well. And some of the areas of target are going to be, for example, applications for the patent office or information around designs or information around schematic diagrams for some kind of new invention. Or it could even be an older invention that could be, for example, critical to the government, like a classified piece of information. Ransom. Now, this is a phenomena that is actually fairly new in the world of IT, from a historical perspective, meaning that ransomware, has been around, but it really picked up the last few years, where we have, for example, the ability to send out basically a virus that can affect, basically a Trojan horse, really, that can affect basically someone's computer, could be an account, could be a phone, whatever that issue is. Basically, we need to be very aware of the fact that this this hijacker of your account information is requesting money or some kind of cryptocurrency, usually as well, to unlock the computer. And if you don't pay the ransom, then what they typically do is leave it locked, or they just delete your information. And this has happened to several counties and cities and hospitals, and again, is a relatively common issue to do it. Lastly, revenge or even corporate image harm. For example, there was a Citibank employee about 2 years ago or so in Texas who didn't like the performance bonus he received and thought he was going to get fired. So he decided to insert basically some scripts into some Cisco switches, which basically kicked off at a certain time, affected the Trojan horse. When an event happened, it kicked off, and it shut down the core routers. Of course, that was a big event. Screwing with the government banks is not a good idea and can land you in prison. So this stuff does happen. We have to be aware of that. And as an IT professional, we have to be able to identify these threats. And the best tools out there are going to be around SIEMs. These are going to be security incident monitors, IDSs, intrusion detection systems. This could be host or network type systems. Next generation firewalls, for example, Palo Alto has some great solutions out there. Endpoint security. We want to be able to ensure that our API gateways are secure. Remember, the endpoint is actually the point of access that our applications will connect to get into the cloud service. And so if we have an attacker that can crack the certificates or can crack passwords, then that is not good for endpoint security, because the endpoint is sort of like the front door to your house. We don't want to give out the key, right? Cloud brokers have some really good solutions out there as well to consider. A honeypot. Now, a honeypot is traditionally what we would place in a DMZ, a demilitarized zone in a network. Basically, we would have a separate network to segment our front end from our back end, or the firewall from the external traffic to the internal traffic. And then analytics, being able to look at data and behaviors is critical to be able to analyze, especially in APT, an advanced persistent threat. So what do we do around this? Well, we want to look at specific tools in AWS to help us solve these challenges, to help us mitigate security threats, to help us provide value to our enterprise. Some of the tools, for example, is Security Hub. I'll go ahead and walk you through that here shortly. We have Macy. This is a security service. And what this does is this approaches basically our security posture using automated intelligence. It's able to pick up on patterns and react to those patterns, send you alerts. We have the ability to integrate this with other services and solutions. When it comes to compliance tools, we want to be able to audit appropriately, and using audit artifacts could provide that compliance tool that can meet our needs. Now, what happens if we have a botnet going on that's basically running a DDoS attack? What can we do to prevent that? DDoS protection is provided through the AWS Shield. And then when it comes to monitoring, CloudWatch, we could set up great capacity with CloudWatch. And also, too, CloudTrail could be used for log files as well. And there's plenty of other tools when it comes to AWS services. And here's an example of some of the security tools we could use. We could use Amazon Inspector. This could look at our packets. This could look at our trace files, etc. We could use Macy and tie in our flow logs and AWS GuardDuty. And again, we could basically have everything filtered. We could use basically a third-party service like Fortinet that has some great value that it can provide. Now, Security Hub is a really nice, what I would call utility, where it really does more than one thing. It really provides basically not only a viewpoint, but the ability to conduct checks on demand. It uses AWS GuardDuty, it uses Inspector, it uses Macy, and is able to provide us that value-added console. And here's an example of Amazon Macy, and I'll go to a demo on these here shortly. Then Amazon Inspector, we could run what's called a security assessment. This is going to allow us to proactively search for issues that may come up. Let's say we deploy a fleet of virtual machines, and we want to look at our resources and see, are those virtual machines securely deployed? And here's an example of Security Hub. Remember, Security Hub combines pretty much all the other services that are listed here, right? It's an integration point that provides basically a console view. It's taken information from GuardDuty, information from Inspector, information from Macy as well. And it's providing us graphics, for example, as well as a summary into vulnerabilities that may exist. When it comes to building a threat reduction strategy, we want to identify the threats. And to do that, that threat could be an insider or it could be an outsider. We want to look at the different steps that are involved in a kill chain. For example, we want to identify on the right here, these are some examples of the steps. We want to look at how people are being recruited, for example. In Silicon Valley, it's really a big deal because one of the things that you can run into is you have a lot of foreign workers that may work for different governments indirectly, but also too, even in the US, we have a lot of competition. There's been cases where employees would skip companies and would bring the information from that previous company to another company. And also too, if you think about it, when an employee leaves, their interest in your company goes down quite a bit. And therefore, we want to mitigate issues that can come up, such as data dissemination. So we want to make sure accounts are shut down and our services are scanned appropriately to mitigate issues like that. And then we'll address components as well as part of that kill chain. So what is this, a cloud adoption framework? What is this all about? Now, AWS or Amazon has significant experience around deploying clouds. And one of the things that's really important is that AWS has collected quite a bit of best practices, quite a bit of what to do, what not to do. They've devised strategies and they work with customers that have, of course, their own approach. And they've been able to put this all together into what is called the CAF, and that CAF has what's called different security perspectives. These security perspectives basically is what comes out of the result of working with thousands of customers over the last 10 plus years. And on the right, you can see that as part of that too, there's also what's called security epics. These are areas of focus that customers typically would handle and identify how they work and how they perform as well. And that's part of course, a best practice that you as a customer might want to consider. So let's go to the whiteboard here. And when we talk about security, one of the things, let me go ahead and maximize that. One of the things we really want to think about here is, let me get my whiteboard, is we really want to think about, for example, how we're going to use cloud services, but also how we connect on-prem. Now, as a best practice, we really want to try to integrate our services here. And basically, when we're considering on-prem, we want to be able to take our services in AWS and generally connect them up to on-prem. So for example, if I have, for example, applications like Hadoop or something running, then I might want to tie them into services in AWS. So what does that mean? Well, I need to think about how I'm going to connect AWS to my on-prem. Do I want to use a VPN? Do I want to use a more dedicated interconnect approach like Direct Connect? These are just some of the things we have to consider. So if we are running services in AWS, then we probably should be using security services that can help. And it could be GuardDuty. It could be basically AWS Macie. It could be our WAF firewall, whatever that is. So we really should be considering not only our on-prem tools, but tools in AWS that we're using. And it could be any number of tools. So with that said, we want to really take a holistic approach to how all this really works. So we need to look at AWS and how does all this integrate, but also to how does it integrate over here. And we could certainly use third-party tools as well. So for example, we may be using something on-prem and we could, of course, integrate it as well. Maybe we're using Fortinet or using a third-party CAB. Whatever that is, we may want to consider that. Now let's talk about GuardDuty before we go to a demo. Now with GuardDuty, we want to be aware that this tool, this security tool, is meant to help you as an enterprise identify events. And as part of this, what it does is it looks at past events and analyzes these events to be able to provide value to you through typically a dashboard. We'll talk about how all this works here in a minute. But basically realize that GuardDuty is taking information from sources, not just comparing what you have now, but it's comparing, for example, to other best practices. So basically, it'll receive inputs from multiple data streams. So for example, it'll be receiving input from AWS, from CERT, from also third-party vendors. And also, too, it'll help you identify what are the possible malicious IPs and domains. For example, there's certainly some websites out there that are well known for sending out malicious information. And AWS has proactively built that in to avoid any of your users from having to click on the wrong links and getting infected. Now, GuardDuty, what it does is it searches the customer's specified inputs. Now, these inputs are basically going to be the VPC flow logs, could be AWS CloudTrail, which is a logging service, and then DNS logs as well. So basically, it's looking at the logs to identify patterns, but also anomalies as well. We could also set a whitelist and a blacklist as well, basically specifying who can access the service and who can't. Here's an example of running GuardDuty and the sample output that you can get. And again, remember, it's going to search these websites and your logs and put out information. We would be able to take the trusted IP list, for example, and basically when we say trusted IP, that's a whitelist. So if I add that, I'm basically saying it's sort of like having a key reader, you just swipe it and you're in. And a threat list is a blacklist. We're basically blocking sites. For example, commonly customers will block anything that is, for example, could be a gambling website, a pornography website, but also they'll block foreign government sites as well. Those are the three most common areas we want to identify here. Now let's talk about GuardDuty before we go to the demo. Now, the way GuardDuty is going to work here is I am going to, for example, we have Macy, we have Inspector, and let me go ahead and put that in different colors so it's easier to see. Probably blue. And so we have these three services. We have Macy, Inspector, and of course, other logs that we could look at as well and put it all together. But basically, we're taking basically GuardDuty, and it's being proactive for us as part of essentially Macy, really. So for example, here, let me just write it down so that it's a little bit more obvious. Let's see. And for example, we're basically taking information from these sources, GuardDuty, Inspector, and other sources as well, and send it over to Macy. So let's go ahead and go to the demo now. Oops. Okay. So let's go to the demo. Just want to make sure I'm on the right path there. All right, so I am in the AWS Management Console. Now, when we consider deploying our AWS services, we want to be aware we could use, of course, AWS services, or we could also tie in other services in the AWS marketplace if we so choose in some cases. Now, when we talk about GuardDuty, we want to think about a few things. But before we do that, let's go ahead and find it. So when I type in GuardDuty, this will bring me over to AWS GuardDuty. So this will bring up a console, and you'll see that it'll bring up basically findings, as they're called. Now, you can see that there's sample data. You could load the sample data for basically demo purposes for playing around as well. And what this is going to do is this is sort of telling us, in this case, that we have an opening. We have, for example, unauthorized access. For example, this one here, Tor IP caller, this is saying that they're manipulating our proxy network and using Tor to send out information outside of our domain. Now over here, this is basically pointing out the obvious, but basically it's important, right? What it's doing is it's saying, Joe, you're using the root account. Do you really want to use the root account in your day-to-day activity? And the answer probably in most cases would be no, unless if you're doing a lot of configuration. Generally create a sub account, and that'll minimize the damage if your account gets stolen. And then over here, this is basically saying that there is a port open. In other words, it is not protected by a firewall. Or in this case, it's saying that it's being probed. Basically here, it says that there's an unprotected port which is being probed by a malicious host. Well, already I just deployed this morning, and guess what? There's already someone scanning ports against IP addresses, and it picked it up. Now, again, this one here is around CloudTrail logging. CloudTrail is an audit tool that we want to use to ensure that we are keeping track of who does what, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, so that if we run into an audit, then we will not have any challenges from a compliance or legal standpoint, hopefully. So this is GuardDuty. Now I can go over here to settings, and this gives me my detector ID. So what this does, essentially AWS is deploying basically a little sandbox of resources, and it's called the detector ID that you're using. And I have the ability to set up the CloudWatch events based on what I am willing to deal with. Now remember, if you send it too high or too low, you could be getting too many alerts or too little. You'll need to figure that out on the type of alerts and what you're actually looking for. Now lists. This is our IP whitelist and our blacklist. And then accounts. We then can go over here, add accounts as well. This tells you what's new. And now for those interested, GuardDuty has a free trial as part of being an AWS user. Now again, you'll get charged after 30 days, so do turn it off. Whether you use it or not, you are paying a monthly subscription based on what you are analyzing. Now, I just deployed this morning around 8 a.m. Eastern time, and I deployed one virtual machine and 2 storage buckets. And you can see that I had over 3,000 events. The flow logs were 156K, and the DNS logs are just under 4.5 KB, that is. And it'll tell you the daily cost after the free trial. Now, if I go over here to, let me shut off my email, sorry about that. What we want to do is go next, let's see, go to inspector first. Now, inspector is going to allow me to run an assessment. And what's nice is I could go over here and I could tell it, do I want to create an assessment for my network resources? Or do I want to create an assessment for my hosts? So I could do one or the other or both. It's up to me. If I go here to advanced setup, I can then tell it to install the agents automatically. For example, if you have EC2 VMs, instead of you manually logging into them, this will install the agents on those VMs automatically for you. Or just go over here to run the appropriate commands to do that. Now this will basically tell us the rule packages it'll look for. So this is like a template, and the template is just reviewing policies and identifying. Does the user have SSH disabled if it's open to the public? Does the user have, for example, AWS config turned on, or do they not? Is auditing enabled? Is it yes or no? Then I go next, I could tell it to assign specific rules. I could also tell it how basically when to run. I could set up every week if I want, or every day, whatever I so choose. Now I'll go ahead and run that report. And you can see that it hasn't fully ran yet. And you can see there it says none. Now if I go over here and I select that, I can then run that report. And now it's going to start collecting information. And what's nice about this is that I could go out and basically go over here, for example, to assessment runs and sort this down by the type of severity. For example, info is or low would be something like you're using the root account. A high would be that they discover what might be a botnet on your EC2 instances. So again, these are some things that you can do automatically. Let's go to the dashboard. Now, when I go to recent findings, you can see there I have some information to look at. I have medium and I have informational. Now, medium is telling me that this ARN, that's the ARN of the inspector report, is running this assessment against the instances. And it looks like what it is saying is that SSH is reachable from the internet, right? So we don't want to have SSH open to the internet. We need to have a firewall port blocking that. And then we have Security Hub. Now, a Security Hub is going to give us this nice, pretty graphical pictures to look at based on the activity. And again, we can go ahead and scroll over this, and it'll tell us basically what has been going on. Now, again, there isn't too much information. There isn't a lot of work going on here, but we could highlight it and it'll point out any issues. Now, Security Hub will, of course, create for us what is a compliance background or a benchmark. And again, I could go ahead and view the results of the non-compliant services that might be open or not maintained properly. This will tell me you want to ensure MFA is turned on. Severity is low. If I select this, this will tell me specific rules to look at. It also provides me resources to look at to fix this. Now, it isn't like Microsoft Azure Security Center where it'll actually remediate the issues with you or with your service. If you just click it, this is still a manual process. And then we have AWS Macy. And Macy now will provide us this basically AI generated dashboard and report, as well as a view, I should say, to let us know what exactly is going on in our environment. Now, if I select the number of risks or minimum risks, you can see when I change that, it's actually increasing the risk. So for example, the higher the number, the higher the risk. The lower the number, the lower the risk. So over here, it's saying that perhaps I may need to look at my CloudTrail logs. And again, it's telling me that the range might be incorrect, so I may want to look at that. But I could go over here and look at different S3 bucket objects. And you can see that it is showing my objects, but also telling me, for example, that these are areas of improvement to consider. If I go here, this tells me in the last day I've had over 55,000 events, which is totally mind-blowing, right? And again, I have nothing running, but again, I have one VM and I have 2 storage buckets. That's it. And it already says that there's been 55,000 events, right? So that's quite a bit. And then user sessions. Now, again, this is collectively taking everything from AWS. So it's not just my service, but it's pretty fascinating the number of events that have been generated just since I deployed this. Now, this is going to look for basically what's called PII, priority data. Now, for example, in the US, we have this number called the Social Security number. This is our identifying number that we have. We're given this at birth, and that's considered private information. We don't want to lose it, because if we lose it, then someone could steal our benefits and also could run up our credit report, so on and so on. But the main thing is to know about this is that this points it out to you directly. For example, if you're monitoring users, then what it'll do is it'll watch what the user does and what the user drops, for example, on a bucket. If it sees that someone puts in a text file that says password or SSN number, then it would likely send you an alert, because it is looking for example, specific information. Over here, credit card number, IPv4, IP address, name, address, national ID. These are just some of the things to look at. Over here shows your Macy S3 objects. Again, these are the objects that it is monitoring. And then these are the public buckets that are objects that also I have grouped together. And then these are the URLs that I have created as well. So again, I have the ability to select this. And what this does is this provides me a visual. Gives me a value of 4 results. And if I scroll down, you'll see that there's my 4 results. Basically, I granted a URL. Basically, what I did is I created an open bucket and left it open. And this would be CloudTrail. This would be location. So you could see here that it's showing me a map, and it's showing me who is accessing my resources right now. Now, interestingly enough, I actually have no idea who this is. So that does tell me that there's something going on. And what that probably is this is actually an AWS service that is now running against my AWS resources. I'm in Jacksonville, Florida. And again, this is telling me the activity that's going on. So that's pretty cool. So for example, if I had 100 users, it would show me those 100 users' locations. And this could provide some visual insight. Over here, it could be objects that I want to monitor. Then this is telling me the ISP. So this will break down where people are coming from. My provider is ATT Uverse, and then Amazon. I'm on the Amazon backbone running some of these services. And that makes sense. And then users that have been created. Pretty neat. A lot of great insight could be provided with the use of AWS Macie, AWS GuardDuty, and other tools as well, right? So we have a lot. Also, too, CloudWatch could be used as well. Now, if I go back, also, too, before I get out of Macie, I go over here to Settings, and what I could do is go to Theme, for example, and you can see there that it says the title. For example, I could look for certain keywords. For example, delete, create, banking keywords, or credit card keywords. For example, some of the keywords would be for credit card would be what? We would have, for example, the number on the back, for example, of your card. That's like a CRC number, for example. And again, every card was going to have also too, basically an expiration date, but they also may have that CRC number as it is known in the industry. So that's just one example of what we could look for. Then if I go down to, let's see, restricted, and then also too, you do have like MasterCard, Visa, and American Express as well. Then if we scroll down here, I could also look for secret markings. Also too, so security keywords. If I click that, this will tell me to look for these keywords. So security number, SSN, or tax ID. If I go to alerts, there's no alerts at this time. Again, I need to set up some users to be able to get use out of that. But if I go to integrations, I need to select the account ID, and then I need to choose a retention. But if I select this, this will allow me to add specific buckets. To select all buckets and then add. Now also too, oh, this is basically saying here, yeah, so it has to be in the current region. So I'm in Northern Virginia. So what I'd want to do is make sure when I select my buckets, they can't be in Oregon, they have to be in this specific region. So again, you'd go back, create a new bucket, and then add it. So again, very simple tool that we could use. Now let's go to the console. And then in CloudWatch, and I know we're running out of time, I'm almost done. We go over here and actually look for anomalies as well. You can see there that it's monitoring these services. And then if I go look, I can see that there's been some write bytes going on. And again, not much activity because we just have VMs that are just sitting there waiting to be told what to do. It's set up rules as well. For example, as part of this, when I set up Inspector, it creates a rule for CloudWatch to monitor. And then lastly, when I go over here to Lambda, one of the nice things we could do is we could create basically a microservice or a function or a webhook or a trigger, as they're called, and basically create a function name. and then select the runtime environment. Then I would create basically a new role with it, or I could use an existing role, so on and so on. I would create that function. And this allows me to add script and code to this as well. And there's also templates. And you can see here, I could design and I could add a trigger. For example, let's say I want to have it trigger on someone adding an object, a put. So when I add an object, that is basically a put. I'm putting something in there. Could add, for example, a prefix or a suffix. For example, one of the common things might be is I don't want to have in this bucket JPEG files or videos, for example, MP4 files. I could have it search for that and trigger an email based on that. And you can see that it triggers on S3. It'll send a Lambda, and then it'll send an alert to CloudWatch. Very simple to set up. And again, just one thing we could do, we could test it as well. I could add my code and then create that as well. Now, when it comes to the presentation, we want to be aware that if we are going to be focused on AWS security, there is a great exam. It is called the AWS Security Specialization. It is based on how to handle an incident, how to deal with threats, basically, how to use logging and monitoring. It talks about the exact infrastructure security tools that we just covered, how to deal with identity and access management, and then data protection. So let's put it all together and find out what hopefully we can come to the conclusion over. We know that we should be able to use AWS services in a complementary manner to add to our capabilities. Basically, to add to our security posture is the way I should also phrase that. We should be aware that AWS and security are complementary. The better your security planning is, the better results you're going to get out of AWS services. AWS has a robust solution. What we want to be aware of is that there's a portfolio of services we could use, and we could add to it or take it away. We could use on-prem, we could use third-party services, whatever we feel would work in our situation. And here are some additional resources to learn more. And then lastly, for resources on Quick Start, there's, of course, a wealth of AWS courses to consider to gain more expertise around AWS as well as security as well. Thank you. And if there's any questions, feel free to speak up.
Thank you, Joseph. And if there are any questions later, you can always reach out to us at expertconnect.quickstart.com, or just leave a comment in this video if you're watching this on YouTube. And thank you, Joseph, for this wonderful session. And we'll hopefully turn this into a series or something, and we'll do weekly or at least twice a month sessions like these. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you again. Have a great night.
Have a good night, everyone. Bye.
Yes.